Welcome to the Listen Up podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Hi, everybody. Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the Listen Up podcast, where I feature leaders in healthcare. This episode is brought to you by Listen Up Hearing Center. We help people to effectively treat their hearing loss, to remain socially connected, and remain independent. The reason I'm so passionate about hearing loss is because I lost my brother Robbie twice. First to the hearing loss from radiation to his brain tumor, and later from complications from that brain tumor. I only care for ears. I'm the E of ENT. I performed over 10,000 ear surgeries and care for thousands of patients with hearing loss. I'm the author of a book called Listen Up, A Physician's Guide to Effectively Treating Your Hearing Loss. To learn more about that, go to www.listenuphearing.com. Today, I'm very excited. I have Dr. Douglas Beck. He is a prominent audiologist who is an awesome educator. I saw him give a lecture. It was wonderful, and that's why I want to have him on the podcast today. He earned his master's degree at the University of Buffalo and then his doctorate from the University of Florida. Then he went to the House Ear Institute and Clinic. That's where I did my fellowship as well. And he did research in cochlear implants and intraoperative monitoring. In 1988, he became the director of audiology at St. Louis University, and then he co-founded a private practice. Then again, he changed, and then in 1999, he became the editor-in-chief of Audiology Online, speechpathology.com, and healthyhearing.com. These are prominent websites in our area. Dr. Beck joined Oticon in 2005 as the director of professional relations. From 2008 to 2015, he was the web content editor for the AAA, which is the American Academy of Audiology. In 2016, he became an adjunct professor of communications disorders and science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And in 2016, he was appointed the senior editor of clinical research in the Hearing Review. And then in 2019, Oticon promoted him to the vice president of academic sciences at Oticon. He's very prolific. He has 185 publications and over 1,000 abstracts. He's presented extensively all over the United States and the world. I am really excited to have him today as a guest. He's going to be excellent, and he's going to really help us learn more about hearing loss. Dr. Beck, Doug, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Sims. It's a pleasure to work with you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So I'm going to call you Doug. You call me Mark, and it'll work out really well, right? One of the things, we should really start for people to understand is like, talk about the difference between hearing and listening. And then I'll tell you my story about that. But go ahead and tell us the difference.
Well, the difference is day and night. What happens most often in the professional community as well as the public, people use the term hearing and listening as synonyms, and they're not synonymous at all. Hearing is just perceiving sound. Hearing is just detecting sound. Right now, you can hear that tapping, right? And we can all recognize that and say that's tapping. Well, that's your central nervous system. We all know about, we have these little air molecules bouncing around in space and in our atmosphere. They hit your eardrum. They go to the ear canal, they hit your eardrum, they move those three little bones, the malleus and stapes. We go to fluids in the inner ear, endolymph and paralymph, that moves hair cells, outer and inner, and we go up to the brain and all the stuff. So that's hearing. That's a very, very simple function. That's like feeling a pinprick. That's like seeing a light. That's just a very basic, low-level sensory central nervous system function. What's incredibly advanced is listening. Listening is when we apply meaning to that sound. Listening is when we comprehend that sound. Listening is when we take that neural code going up to the brainstem and our brain is able to make sense of it and apply meaning. So what happens is, you might have your dad might be 70, 80, 90, your mom, whoever, and you're at dinner and they can't really make sense of the conversation. So people think, oh, that's hearing loss that goes with aging. Well, first of all, hearing loss doesn't necessarily go with aging. Hearing loss is 1/3 of all people over age 65. It's 2/3 of the population over age 75, but it's certainly not 100%. So there are many people who have absolutely normal hearing. We'll talk about this in just a minute, despite listening difficulty. Now, so a couple of things that need definition. Number one, the population of the United States is about 330 million. Of that, about 1 in 10, or more specifically, about 38 million people have hearing loss. That means if you put them through a hearing test in a sound booth and press the button when you hear the beeps, about 37 to 38 million people will have hearing loss on a hearing test out of the 330 million or so in the US. But then there's another 26 million people, another 26 million who have no hearing loss whatsoever, but they have trouble decoding sound. It's called a SUPRA, supra-threshold listening disorder. And they're very common. As a matter of fact, it could be things like auditory processing disorders, it could be auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, it could be cochlear synaptopathy, it could be hidden hearing loss, it could be ADD, attention deficit disorder, it could be dyslexia, it could be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it could be traumatic brain injury, but more importantly, it could be mild cognitive impairment.
Right.
And it could be, early forms of neurodegenerative processes that lead to dementia. And this is very, very important for us to discover these listening disorders, because what we know is that the Lancet in 2020, Dr. Livingston and his colleagues came out with this brilliant follow-up study showing that about your risk for dementia, about 40% of that risk is due to factors that are modifiable. And I won't recite all 12 of them, but there are things like hearing loss, diabetes, excessive alcohol use, air pollution, right? Lack of exercise, lack of education. All these things contribute to your dementia risk. So what we want to do, and of all of those 12 modifiable risk factors, the number one, the largest, is hearing loss.
Yeah.
And that's, it's kind of startling when you think about it, because we generally think of hearing loss as, running in parallel with aging. But as we said earlier, it doesn't necessarily do that. And it is a very, very damaging thing, because your brain is plastic throughout your entire lifetime. Of course, it's more plastic when you're a child. You learn language, you learn to walk and talk, you learn all those essential skills of life as a child. But your brain is totally capable of changing and learning throughout the entire lifespan. So it's very important to keep your hearing as healthy and as well in good shape as you can throughout your entire lifespan, because the negative deficits of hearing loss are plentiful, and they include things like anxiety and stress. Of course, tinnitus is associated with it. Of course, social isolation, all sorts of health risks that are associated with not hearing well. So it's not just making things louder, it gets to making things clearer. And this is essentially the discussion that you and I had earlier about signal to noise, but I just said a lot of things that maybe you want to clarify. Or
no, I think you're right on. It's something I talk about all the time, that it's the most modifiable factor for the risk of dementia.
Yeah.
And so I oftentimes use the analogy of high blood pressure, and the reason we treat high blood pressure is to decrease your risk of heart attack, and the reason we treat hearing loss is to decrease your risk of dementia. And so it also creates a medical concept rather than a social concept, meaning, there is no such thing as a little high blood pressure, right? I mean, there is, but it should be treated.
Right, exactly. And the most common type and degree of hearing loss is, of course, mild to moderate sensory neural, meaning inner ear hearing loss. And this is exactly the one that is the most damaging, because it's the most common, it's the least diagnosed. I believe the numbers are 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6 people with mild to moderate hearing loss will ever get diagnosed. I mean, because what people do in general is they start to perceive, right? They perceive it as normal, or they think, oh, it's okay, everybody has it. But imagine that in blood pressure. Just a little high blood pressure, that's okay. Everybody gets that with aging. It's not okay. It's the number one risk of death, other than now that we have the COVID era. But so COVID is the number one reason people die in the USA right now. But number 2 is still cardiovascular stuff. And so it gets to your point exactly, which is, how much high blood pressure are you willing to risk? And the answer is you shouldn't risk any. Right. It's not just death, right? It's stroke. It's having heart attacks. It's quality of life. It would be quite difficult if you suffered negative adverse effects from cardiovascular disease, which can be preventable with minimal care, just like blood pressure medicine.
Agree 100%. And it really is, taking this away from just being a social issue. It's a medical issue.
Absolutely.
That's really essential for people to understand in terms of hearing loss. And that's one of the reasons I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, and I think we have to be, because we are the experts. We are the people that the public will turn to when it's 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 6. And for those people, we have to do our very best because we're not just helping them hear, we're protecting their brain.
Right. Well, I mean, right. So it's getting people to understand that it's so much more than just your ear, right? That it's your brain, right? And one of the examples I use is foreign languages, right? Just because you hear the foreign language doesn't mean you understand it. There's clearly a brain function. If I started speaking if somebody started speaking Mandarin Chinese to me, I don't understand it. My brain doesn't have that capacity. So clearly, we do know that the brain is involved in listening and comprehension. And so
that's such a perfect example. Hearing is perceiving sound, listening is making sense of sound. And this is the thing that the most difficulty that most of us will have is understanding speech in noise. Right. And that's a clarity issue when you think about it. You're hearing that Mandarin, you're hearing French or Italian or German or Spanish or whatever language you don't speak. You're hearing it, but you can't make sense of it. And that's just a perfect analogy because that's what it's like when you have any of these supra-threshold listening disorders. You can hear, that people are speaking, you're detecting voices, but you can't make sense of it. So what the go-to, is people think, well, we need to make stuff louder. The problem with that is when you make it louder, you also make the background noise louder. And any audiologist, any otolaryngologist, neurotologist, hearing aid dispenser, any hearing healthcare professional will tell you what most people do after they get hearing aids is they start to take them out, particularly in restaurants. And you wonder, well, why would they do that? Well, because it's too loud, because it's too noisy, and because that hearing aid most hearing aids are not particularly good at separating speech from noise. The goal of good hearing aid fitting is to improve the signal to noise ratio. So that means that I want the person that I want to attend to is the person who I want to be louder than the background noise. So I try not to speak about decibels too much because decibels become very scientific very quickly. For instance, 0.0002 dynes per centimeter squared is our reference point for SPL. Nobody wants to hear that. So think about this instead. Think about if an average conversation occurs at 50, let's take a scale of 0 to 100. And a normal conversation might be at a 50 on a scale of 100. So when you're in a background noise that's at 60, which happens all the time, so you're at this deficit of 10. And people, it's very challenging for your brain to say, I want to pay attention to this guy at 50, but all the noise around me is at 60. So what the hearing aid's goal is to take that 50 and try to amplify that a little bit while decreasing that 60 down to maybe a 45. Right. So when you think about the numbers on a relative continuum like that, it starts to make a little bit more sense. But what most hearing aids do, what most amplifiers do, what most over-the-counter products do, what most PSAPs do, personal sound
amplifiers, they don't filter.
Right. They make everything louder. So you're in the office with the patient and the patient's seeing you for sensory neural loss. And they say, well, Dr. Sims, I did fine with you in the office, but when I took my significant other out to eat, we went to dinner that night, I couldn't understand what he or she was saying. So I took him out and I heard better. Well, of course you did, because now your brain has the full complement of sounds and the brain needs to have all of that information. And in some respects, traditional hearing aids restrict that, and they restrict it through things like directionality, which could be very helpful in some situations. So if my hearing aid has directional ability to amplify who's in front of me more than people on the side, that's good. That's great.
As long as you're facing them, yep.
Yeah, as long as you're facing them, because the benefit there is going to be 2 or 3. It happens to be 2 or 3 decibels. But again, don't worry about the term decibel. So if my deficit is 10, so I want to pay attention to Dr. Sims, who's speaking at a 50, but we're in a restaurant where all the noise is 60, and I put on a directional hearing aid that benefits me 2 or 3 dB, I'm still at a 7 decibel deficit.
Yeah.
So my complaint is going to be now it's loud and I still can't make sense of it. But there are some hearing aids, and there's some very simple technologies. They're called digital remote microphones, FM systems, even simple pocket talkers, where somebody might have to speak into a microphone. But now when we're using those types of technologies or excellent hearing aids, now we can improve the signal to noise ratio by 5, 6, 7. A directional remote mic, I don't have one here, but they're about this size. I don't know if you can see that, but you would
have a pen. They're like,
you'd clip that on your collar. Now we're going to improve the signal to noise ratio by 12 to 15. and in some situations up, 15 to 20. So all of a sudden, all of that cacophony of noise, all of those distractions, all of those reasons that you can't understand speech noise go away because somebody's actually speaking into a microphone and making it a substantial improvement in signal to noise ratio.
And so how do you measure that with the hearing aid?
Yeah, the best way to do that, I've got a number of publications on this. What I usually advocate, the easiest, most direct, most pragmatic way to do it is there are tests that are speech and noise tests. And so what I would advocate, and this is very difficult for a consumer to do on their own, almost impossible, really.
Yeah.
But any hearing care provider can help you with this. You take your own ears, just take them with you, go to an audiology or a hearing aid dispensing office or an ENT office, and you ask them to do a speech and noise test. And that'll give us a score. Let's say the score is 5. And then what you want to do is put on your hearing aids, and they'll test you again on speech and noise. And ideally, clearly, the score should improve, maybe to 10, 12, 15. If it doesn't, then there's something wrong. I mean, if all the hearing aid is doing is making it louder, well, that solves the problem of it wasn't too loud. That's not the number one complaint. The number one complaint is it wasn't clear enough. So these are not necessarily things that people can do at home. But if you're buying over-the-counter products, if you're using a hearing aid that you're not sure that it fits well and it's not acting properly, it's not really a benefit, the number one test to get is a speech and noise test. And virtually every not only can hearing care professionals do this, but it's in best practices by the American Academy of Audiology, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the International Hearing Society. In their best practice statements, every single one of those national organizations says the hearing healthcare provider should be doing a speech and noise test to document the benefit. Because again, if we're not making it easier to listen, then we're just making it louder.
No, I agree 100%. I mean, one of the things I talk to patients about is, kind of the one and done or 3 and done care providers, right? They'll say, okay, you have your hearing aids, come back and see us if you need us. Or, oh, you get 2 more visits, come back and see us if you need us. And I always say to them, how do you know if you need them if you don't know what you're not hearing?
Right. And this is
so they think about it like you aren't hearing as well, which is the absence of sensing something. So how are you going to know that you actually need to go back? And that's why we see people who have, totally clogged domes, right? Or, non-functioning hearing aids, and they don't even realize that the technology is not helping them. It's tragic.
It is. And, there are so many measures that hearing care professionals can offer. Now, if it's just testing the hearing aid, is the hearing aid doing what it's supposed to do? Is it working up to spec? That takes me about 3 minutes to run a hearing aid in a hearing aid test box and see if it's programmed correctly and to see if it is doing what it's supposed to do. And I can do that with a manufactured expensive hearing aid, and I can do that with a cheap piece of junk that you might have bought at Walmart, because a lot of people, people are waiting for OTC and they think it's going to be magical. I think there'll be some benefits. I think there'll be some detriments. You don't have to wait. If you want to buy a cheap hearing aid, you can go to walmart.com and you can buy 2 hearing aids right now for $299. But the problem with those is that you're picking blindly. You don't know your type and degree of hearing loss. You don't know if you have hearing versus a listening disorder. And by the way, there are lots of publications that have said, can patients tell whether they have, mild, moderate, severe, profound loss? And can they tell whether it's a listening disorder or a hearing disorder? And the answer is pretty much no, because of exactly what you said. You can't know what you can't perceive. Right. So, you and I cannot see ultraviolet. We can't see X-ray. We can't see, we can't see the entire visual spectrum. We see a very, very small. The best example that I can give is with sound. There are sounds that occur all around us that we have no idea, even if you have absolutely perfect hearing. For instance, human hearing is said to go 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. You've heard this a million times over in your career. So 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, that's human hearing. But it gets crazy because you think about, well, when you and I were kids, we had cassettes. We didn't have CDs or MP3s or any of those things. So a cassette, you'd go to buy the really good ones like BASF or TDK or Maxell, and they say perfectly flat out to 40,000 hertz. And I'm a musician, so I would say, oh, that's really cool, but humans can't hear that. And then my musician friends would all say, oh, I can hear the difference. None of them can hear the difference. This is really well known to science. It's just not really well known to musicians, who I love, but still. So the thing is, human hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000. And of that, not really, because you're really only using about 30 hertz to maybe 12,000 hertz is where 99.9% of all speech and environmental sounds. Yeah. So if I gave you a tone right now at 15,000 hertz and a tone at 20,000 hertz, you probably couldn't tell the difference, because human hearing way up at 15 and 20,000 hertz is not very sensitive. Okay, back to my point. But your dog and your cat can both hear like 35,000 hertz. And you and I can't. So there's sounds that your dog can hear. Like I raise German Shepherds. I usually raise German Shepherds. And sometimes, your dog will startle. And you look around and you don't hear anything. You don't see it. Your dog did. That's why we have those dog whistles, which I've never used, but, that go 30,000 hertz. And your dog totally can perceive that, whereas you and I can't. So this is the thing, is that it's so important to hear, but you have to realize human hearing is not very good in the animal kingdom. Whales hear out to 140,000 hertz. You and I limited to 20,000 hertz. Again, 12,000 of that might be useful. And this is the thing, that's hearing. The reason we're the top of the food chain is not our hearing. We're the top of the food chain because of our listening ability, our ability to attribute meaning to sound. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big things that I'm concerned about is, we all talk about non-treatment, but I also think undertreatment is a big problem. And that population who thinks they've treated their hearing loss, but they haven't, right? That's pretty tough. It's a tough population.
It is, and it's going to be difficult for any single person to be able to tell what they're not perceiving. Whether visually, when I turned about 40, all of a sudden,
the letters aren't clear, so you have a vision problem.
Right, and then you put on a pair of really inexpensive glasses, and all of a sudden, what I remember was seeing my fingerprints again. Yeah. I didn't realize that I wasn't able to see the details of that until I put on glasses. With hearing loss, it comes up very slowly over time for most people. And so they don't really perceive that they're no longer hearing what they used to hear. They start to notice things aren't clear. So that could be hearing loss. That could be a listening disorder. And the only real way to know is you got to go into an office like yours. You need to, get and the whole idea of screening, I think, is insane. I am not a fan of screening for anything, for anybody at any time. Newborn infant screening, yes. And COVID screening, yes. But hearing screening isn't going to pick up those 26 million people. They have very, very legitimate listening disorders that not one screening is going to pick up. You go and press the button when you hear the beep. You're not going to see ADD, ADHD, dyslexia. You're not going to see neurocognitive. You're not going to see mild cognitive impairment. You're not going to see auditory processing disorders. They don't show up when your test is only a test of loudness.
Right. It's one of those things where, interestingly, we all know you got to measure your blood pressure to see if you have hypertension. And so to the same extent, I think you need your hearing checked and or measured, right?
And when you go in and you're getting if your physician suspects you have high blood pressure, you're probably going to get an EKG. They're probably going to look to see if there's anything else going on. And they're probably going to order a complete, CBC to see a complete blood panel to see what's going on with this patient in depth. Because oftentimes when you have high blood pressure, there are secondary things going on. Not always. And then hopefully it's just a very simple matter and you can take a pill for the rest of your life and control it and everything will be great. But we don't just look at this point that you're making is so important, that we don't just look at your pulse, your respiration, and your blood pressure. If we see an abnormality there, we want to rule out if there's anything dangerous going on. It's the exact same thing with hearing. When we have a hearing disorder or a listening disorder, and they're not silos, you can absolutely have both, right? So when we see one of those things, it alerts us that you don't need a screening, you need a diagnostic test. Let's look deeper. Let's make sure everything's okay. If everything's okay, awesome, you win. It's a simple problem and we can solve it. But if we don't look to figure out why is this happening and are there other comorbidities, other secondary issues, we're missing the forest for the trees. And this is why you went to school for 12 years. And this is why I went to school for 8 years, is so we know what to look for and we kind of know how these things work together. And hearing loss is never simple. Hearing is relatively simple compared to listening, but there's so much more to know. And you brought this up earlier that, when you look at dementia risk, we're not just trying to make you hear louder. We're trying to preserve your brain and your quality of life and make things as good as we can. And that's why we're licensed to do this kind of work. It's very, very important that we don't get tricked or fooled into thinking that because I read it on the internet, it's true, because the label says this, it applies to me. Professionals, Dr. Google is good, and I think that there's certainly a place for online searches and for knowledge that we acquire online and on labels and whatnot, but that certainly does not replace professional guidance and professional opinion and professional management.
Yeah, my mantra is there's a difference between getting hearing aids and getting your hearing loss treated.
Yeah, I like that. That's good.
Right.
I'll steal that if you don't mind.
Because getting the objects is one thing, getting comprehensive treatment is another, and people need their hearing loss treated.
Right.
Well, this has been great, Dr. Beck. Doug, I really appreciate it. Hey, if people want to get a hold of you, how do people get a hold of you?
Probably the easiest way. I have a website. I'm not trying to sell anything on my website. In fact, my website loses money because I don't sell anything on my website. But if you go to douglaslbeck.com, I think page 2 or page 3 is a contact me, and it shoots an email to me. So douglaslbeck.com, all one word. And I now have I think 208 publications, and they're all available for free. And so you go to the links and PDFs, and you can look down the list there. And if any of them strike you as interesting, you can print them or download.
That's great. And so the last question I always ask everybody, well, there's two. One is I ask people, we all have mentors in our lives. Who would you thank? Like if this was a award ceremony and they'd say, who helped you get here? Who would you thank for your journey?
Throughout my school, the most important person to me throughout my education was Dr. Jack Katz, who is very well known in audiology and in education. He was a brilliant, he still is a very, very brilliant scholar, an incredible clinician, and just one of the nicest people you've ever met. In the second half of my career, once I started getting more and more involved with medical issues, certainly William F. House, who's the grandfather of neurotology. Dr. House taught me so much, and most people don't know his name. I know that, but if you Google William F. House, you'll see that he invented a couple of really clever things, like the middle fossa approach to acoustic neuromas, like the translabyrinthine approach to acoustic neuromas. We used to be monitoring facial nerves during acoustic neuroma surgery because Dr. Bill House thought, well, I'm looking at the facial recess. I think that's the facial nerve. I wonder. And we would talk about how to figure that out, and we would electrically stimulate it. And Dr. House transformed the world of neurotology. Before Dr. House was Dr. William F. House, neurotologist. He was a dentist, and he invented things like the sidearm on microscopes. Now that it doesn't really matter anymore, because in every operating room in the world, you have television cameras all over so that you can watch what the surgeon is doing.
Huge in the day because people could watch what was going on.
When I was a lad, I used to look through this periscope to watch what Dr. House was doing on these brains that he was operating on. So he invented that. He invented suction irrigation with Jack Urban, who was an engineer. I mean, his contributions, unbelievable. And of course, he's the one who pushed forward cochlear implants in the USA. Most of the people watching this think cochlear implants are a new development. They're actually not. The first cochlear implants.
Quite some time.
1959, and Bill House did 3 of them in 1961 in Los Angeles. So that was 60 years ago.
Yeah, no, I visited Dr. House during my fellowship. I went down and spent a couple of days with him. He was a really amazing guy. So
and a real sweetheart. I mean,
yes,
just that no ego whatsoever.
No, very unassuming.
He'd be willing to teach anybody anything at any time. So yeah, my mentors, I've got 2, Dr. William F. House and Dr. Jack Katz.
That's great. And so the last question I always ask people: what's your favorite sound?
My favorite sound, probably my daughter's voices.
Oh, that's nice. That's wonderful. So everybody, we have Dr. Beck here. Thank you for coming on. It's been a great episode. Probably we'll have to circle around because there's a lot more to cover. And I think you're really great at explaining things, but thanks for coming on. This has been great.
My pleasure, Dr. Sims. I am grateful and appreciative that you invited me. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Listen Up podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.